Thank you very much, Lucy. Good morning. And hey, good afternoon to you, Mariana Pestana, out in Porto in
Hi,
Portugal.
Glenn.
Hi.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. I think you're our first guest to call in from Portugal, so that's great.
Oh,
How are things there?
things are yeah, relatively calm here.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean it's a very strange moment in time for multiple reasons right now. But yeah, in here, as always, history takes a little bit longer sometimes to be felt in Portugal, and that's the case now. But yeah, in terms of the COVID situation, it's relatively under control, and things, life is starting to go back to normal
Mm.
now.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Mm.
Just before we plunge in, I did want to repeat something Lucy said, which is important, which is, first of all, let us know where you're calling in from, if you don't mind, in the chat. We're always interested to see that. And also, if you have questions for Mariana as we go along, just put them in the chat and we'll get back to them in the last 10, 15 minutes. So Mariana, maybe we could start by talking a little bit about where you came from and how you got into design in the first place. We have a little bit of biographical connection in the sense that we both spent time at the V&A in London.
Yes.
So please mention that. But and in fact, even worked on different ends of the same show about the concept of the future. But could you tell the audience a little bit about how you got into the field of design curating and where the interest came from in the first place for you?
Yeah, so I am an architect by training, and I guess I was very interested in fiction and narrative when I was practicing architecture. But I studied architecture in Porto, so I went to London to seek, to pursue this interest in narrative and fiction. At the time, I went to Central St. Martin's to a program that was investigating some space and narrative. And there I met with Xavi Llarcfont, Zen O'Connell, Carolina Caicedo from the Decorators, and then together we formed the Decorators, a practice. And I guess during that moment, I guess it was through the practice of working together and developing collaborative projects that involved a lot of people, and often stepping into territories where we had to do things that we didn't know how to do. So we would gather groups of people that we would work together with us to develop certain projects, and so I think that the work started to take on this curatorial format in the sense that it was a collection of practices and not just one practice. And so, yeah, for a long time, I've worked always with the decorators, and then sometimes developed curatorial projects but always independently. I think it all began with an understanding of architecture as the sum of different parts, and a kind of admiration for certain architects who collaborated with graphic designers, with sculptors, with the light designers in the making of their projects. In Portugal, for example, there is this duo of architects who did a lot of snack bars and hair salons, and they would set up these highly collaborative structures for each of them. From the name of the place to the very detail of the tablecloth. And I don't know, maybe there was something there about that was a kind of architecture that I admired, and then but slowly that developed kind of accidentally, I should say, Glenn. It developed into a curatorial practice, and then I had more, we could say, classical curatorial training when I was at the V&A, for example, where I worked for almost 4 years in the Department of Architecture, Design and Digital, and there I worked really as a curator in a collections department, even though I was working on a project which was the future exhibition. And that's which is a really it was a really interesting project for me to work on it. And then I've also worked with other institutions such as MAT in Lisbon, or on this project that I developed for the last 6 years or so, called Eco Visionaries, which was an itinerary exhibition that traveled to different places. So
that's a great,
that answers,
yeah, please. It gives us a really good sense of the cross-disciplinary nature of your practice, and also the sense in which there perhaps isn't a strong line of distinction in your mind between curatorial and architectural practice, but that it's all about creating spaces in which events can happen and people can engage. And I think we'll see that very clearly in the case studies that you've brought today to discuss, which are less oriented towards traditional institutional curating. We just thought this might be a more interesting way through the conversation. So we won't be looking at, for example, the V&A exhibition, The Future is Here, but rather looking at your collaborative projects with the Decorators, and then a couple of your independent projects as well. So maybe we could just go ahead and get started. Hope everyone can see the images here. Can you tell us about this first project, which I have to say has a particularly poignant cast right now, with restaurants and other kinds of social space in so many places locked down. So you know, in some ways this feels retrospectively utopian, what you're about to tell us.
Yeah.
Take it away and take us through the story.
Yeah, so this was the first project that together with the Decorators, the first project that we did, and we thought, this is what we want to do, which is a really important moment, I think, in a practice, because until you manage to do something close to what you intended, you can't even describe what it is that you want to do. And so here we had access to a tiny plot of land in a market in London, in East London, called Ridley Road Market, which is a Caribbean market. And this tiny plot of land was owned by a friend of ours, Zoe Chan, and she wanted to do something on this site, but she didn't know quite what. So we started by actually we spent a lot of time in this place, and this is the sort of market that sells everything from suitcases to underwear, eggs, and fruits and vegetables and meat, and so the food was very present there. So we started just by doing some experiments on the ground with cooking food, and we realized that generated a lot of interest, and with people coming to ask us what we were doing, but also saying, you know, that's not how you should be cooking eggs, and that's
everyone's got an opinion about that, I guess.
Yeah.
These are the other Decorators, is that right?
Yes, so there's Xavi closer to the image. He's taking the spinaches from the pan, and then Suzanne and myself and Zoe, who is our friend that had the plot, and Carolina is missing here from the picture, actually. So we decided, okay, perhaps we should do a restaurant of let's take this food a bit further, and what was happening in this market at the time was also that a few supermarkets had opened nearby, and so people weren't shopping food in the market as much. There was this perception that food was maybe a little bit dirty, or not so not of such quality, but we realized that wasn't necessarily true. I just saw someone mentioning Mata Clark's food, and of course that was a very important reference for us. And in the same spirit, you know, we wanted to do an experiment here where we could provide affordable food of high quality. So we set up a system where we invited a chef, different chef or cook every day, and they would write their ingredients, their intended ingredients in this shopping list. And then we ran the restaurant on an exchange system, a food for food exchange system. So people would look at this shopping list and see what else was left, and they would be encouraged to buy that food in the market and then exchange the raw food for cooked meals in the restaurant. And that, you know, in the beginning, this was just a mode of exchange for the food for us, but then it turned into an exchange mode for everything surrounding the restaurant, you know, including, for example, the filling up of our water tank was done in exchange for meals, the music that was played in the restaurant, and all of these different elements. Yeah, so here are two of our chefs signing the board on one day. This was a means to collaborate with a lot of food initiatives nearby, but also friends and collaborators that wanted to cook on a given day. You know, they were invited, and the restaurant was built, you know, with a very so here's like the process of exchange. The restaurant was built with the language of the market. We wanted to almost mimic the market. We also didn't have a lot of money. And so the element that we invested in perhaps was this table in the middle that brought food from, it enhanced this idea of the transformation of food from raw to cooked. And so the kitchen was in the ground floor and prepared there, and then this table would bring the food up to the first floor. And I'd seen this in a palace in Sweden, which was a model I think invented by Catherine the Great, seemingly for privacy concerns, you know, so that employees wouldn't listen to conversations. Of course, here, you know, the problem we had is we didn't have employees, like we were running the restaurant, and this made it a little bit easier for us to run the whole operation. And then all of these elements were developed in collaboration. Everything was bought in the market, all the materials and so on, the plates, the cutlery, etc. We collaborated with Guillermo Rossi, who is a designer and friend of ours, to make the napkins, etc. And yeah, it became, it was really an experiment in about what could be done in such a tiny piece of land. But for us, it set a tone for how we could set up these structures of collaboration, I guess.
Can I ask a question about where the parameters of design are here? Because there's, of course, one very clearly designed element, which is the table, which is this dropping and raising platform.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting to know that that has a kind of aristocratic historical reference too.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, you're designing a situation as well, and also
Yeah.
a mode of exchange. And it strikes me that that barter logic that you brought to the project also indicates maybe a desire to depart from the normal regime of capitalist exchange and creates a sort of ripple of disruption in something that fundamental to our lives. So I wonder how you think about your own role as a curator in that case, maybe making a kind of utopian or alternative gesture of that kind, and how much of that you think of as design related, or maybe
right.
not an important question.
Yeah, that's a really really good question. Certainly there was a desire like that in terms of design parameters, and you know how far this, you know, our design goes into the, you know, the system, the bartering, etc. It's important to say that, you know, as decorators, we have different backgrounds, different design backgrounds. So for example, Carolina has a background in psychology, Xavi in interior design, Suzanne in landscape design, and so when we come together, there isn't such a clear common definition of what constitutes design. and that's I find it to be a quite interesting place of discussion for us. But then also there is the stepping into a field that where we are complete amateurs. We don't know how to run a restaurant, so we need to learn from others, and so there's always this discipline. I think there's this comfort of interdisciplinarity. It's reminding me, there is this essay I read by Julia Kristeva in this wonderful book, The Anxiety of Interdisciplinarity. And she talks about this being always this stepping into a foreign territory a little bit, and it's almost like you're never conscious of your own discipline until you leave it for a period of time. Very much like if you move into another country, or you become much more aware of what you are. And but it's a place of discomfort. But I guess we collectively, we enjoy this discomfort, this disciplinary discomfort, because we find it's productive and it takes us to unknown places, and it's maybe out of curiosity. It's a little bit selfish perhaps, but it just brings us to interesting places. But then there's also something to say here about what was happening in London when we did this, because this was 2010, 11, and a number of practice. This was right after the economic crisis, so of 2008, the credit crash, all of that. And so on the one hand, yes, I think that this perhaps more utopian, or the sense of the urgency to produce alternatives for the models of gentrification that we were seeing around us seemed really important to us, to say, could you renovate the space by changing a program, by working on a program, and not just the materiality of it, and but then this was done also. There were a lot of practices that were doing these sorts of projects in London at the time. Exist had done their Dalston Mill project in an abandoned kind of railway space adjacent to a railway in East London. Practice Architecture did Frank's Cafe in Peckham. Assemble did the Folly for a Flyover. It was a constellation of practices. And once I interviewed Assemble about this for a magazine, and they said, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Practice saw Exist do it and said, hey, we can do it. And then we saw Practice do it and we said, hey, we can do it. And I think we also saw those practices and said, hey, we can do it. There was this sense that there were no jobs really, and there was this sense that you could, or that it was possible for you to start to build, even if you didn't have very good construction techniques, even if you didn't have access to very good materials, but that you could rehearse. And Xavi came up with this wonderful term that we started using, like a rehearsal, because that's how we felt about this at the time, just rehearsing something, but not really feeling like we knew exactly what the final outcome would be.
A great way of reframing the concept of speculative design, sort of rehearsal that never an official performance. Yeah. It also, it's just really nice to hear you describing that moment in 2010, because of course it's such an important template for what we're all going to be facing over the next couple of years as we come out hopefully come out of this economic crisis. Well, let's move on to the next project, which is oriented instead to food, instead it's oriented to sound and to the medium of radio. So, tell us about this one.
Yeah, so here this was a few years later. We had access to this market, and here, as a practice, we were commissioned by a council to develop a project that would investigate what the future of the market could be, but perhaps in their view it was more like activate the market in a way. We were interested in using this opportunity to have a public discussion on the future of this place. And so we started by creating a radio station. First, we had it in a little shop. Then we realized that perhaps it was too hidden away. So we designed a market stall that would contain a radio, all the radio equipment necessary to broadcast programs outside in the public realm. So what we would do is we would take the table out into the market, and we developed a program, a series of programs, from open mic sessions to more focused programs like the one we're looking at, where we would invite counselors and residents and advocates for different ideas within that place to come together and discuss what was going to happen there publicly. And for us, it was a call for responsibility a little bit, making everyone say what their ideas were for this place out in the open. But we also used it as a starting point to discuss what possibilities could be for this market in the future. And for us, it was very important that it would continue to be a civic space, even if maybe it wouldn't work as a commercial space necessarily. So what else could it become? But we believed it should have a civic role, because this market was, in London is a city that is defined a lot more by streets than it is by squares. And the public life in London unfolds around the idea of commerce, of shopping. But in the 50s, in the post-war, quite a few squares, not a lot, but a few were opened. And this is the case. This is a public square. So it's relatively rare. So we believe it should be cherished as this civic jewel. And so through the radio program, we met a lot of people. This was like just a daily routine for a period of time. And then a means for us to meet our future collaborators. So we would hide out in the market and then mix up with the market, and then hope to find collaborators with whom we could test these possible futures.
One of the things I noticed about the images is that you also have what looks to be a strong immigrant community presence in the market. Was that also part of what you were trying to do in building a conversation?
Yes, we were trying to have a transversal conversation, definitely, because in this market there is a very big Bangladeshi community, for example, and a big Irish community, and British as well. So it was, of course, part of our concern when creating these programs was to listen to these different players, let's say, in this space.
And then there was this very interesting kind of offshoot of the initiative into amateur boxing.
Yeah, so this was completely unexpected. We through the radio program, one of the elements of this was a podcast that we developed with Tom Keeley, which was an investigation, almost like a situationist type of research of the territory, and that led us to know and find out about different places. One of them was this the Lansbury Amateur Boxing Club that had been training there in the market in a small unit for a long time. And so we began developing a relationship with them, and eventually we organized a tournament with them. This was their first tournament. So it's a big thing for a boxing club to do, to host the tournament. So we had to really build the confidence, their confidence in us was a really important part of this process, and then ensure that everything ran smoothly. And yes, then there was the tournament. It's interesting now looking at these images, because this was a place where there was a lot of conflict, and in a sense the boxing and the tournament, which brought a lot of people to the square, etc. But it was almost like a very strange moment of also enacting some of that the conflict that was played out in politically in this area.
Yeah, that same thought had occurred to me, because the difference between a radio program and a boxing match is so striking. And you have, on the one hand, the idea of conversation, and on the other hand, the idea of conflict.
Yeah.
And I suppose, although you didn't plan the boxing to be part of what you were doing, it maybe reflects the true dimensional picture of that community and what they were facing in a way that perhaps other more conventional design that's more straightforwardly celebratory would not have done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Well, bring people together.
Yeah.
The restaurant did, though, of course. Okay, so here we're switching to something that you did, I believe, independently rather than with the decorators. Is that right, Mariana?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is project I did. It was a project for the Lisbon Architecture Triennial in Lisbon. Yeah. So Beatrice Galilei was chief curator of the biennial that year, and I was responsible for one of the exhibitions. So yeah, when we spoke the other day, you asked me like, how did you become a curator, right? And I think there was a little bit of it happening here. So my way of practicing was that, of the decorators, this is how there was a way of working. So here I think I pretty much extended that form of practice to a more to one building, you could say. And this was a building, it was a palace, it had a lot of different uses over time, all of them political, because the palace originally belonged to the Marquis of Pombal, who was a very important political figure in Portugal in the Enlightenment. And because it was his house, even though it wasn't a grand palace, it just had that political charge, and then it became an embassy, it became the anarcho-syndicalist movement headquarters. So I thought, it would be interesting to, so first I went, I was fascinated by this history of the building and how, a building would adapt to so different uses just because of its, not because it had any spatial qualities that would justify it, but just because of this heritage of program. Anyway, so I picked some of these uses and then invited I think 6 or 7 designers or architects or artists, a mixture, to each engage with one of those uses that the palace had and bring it to the contemporary time. So here we're looking at the embassy of, the building had been the embassy of Spain, and then I spoke with Paulo Moreira, who's an architect, and Kilo Angikia Henda, who is an artist, and together they came up with this idea of an embassy of no land. So it was like almost like an embassy devoid of any sense of place or time. And then over time, we developed a collaboration with different cities and organizations in Lisbon that were fighting for citizen rights, right to water, for example, amongst others, and they became ambassadors on a rota. So every week, the embassy was given to a group, and they had a carte blanche about, so they could do with the room what they thought would be best for their organization. Of course, that created a lot of tension with the organization, because it was a form of radical hospitality, really, the giving of carte blanche, and hospitality is a really beautiful thing until it isn't, of course. I think, there's a lot we could discuss about hospitality, but I'm really fascinated about this idea I think it's a Derrida, when he writes about hospitality, he speaks about this very common thing when you have a guest in your house, and it's really nice for the first 2-3 days, and then in the third day you no longer know exactly where you should sit in your house or what time you really normally had breakfast, and so you start to feel like a guest in your own
Uh,
house, and so the power relations invert, and to the point where you're made hostage by your guest.
mm,
And so here I think a little bit of that might have been happening at an institutional level, where um, these projects just demanded a lot from the institution, both in terms of timetables, etc., but then also because they were ugly, some of them, and that was difficult to
ug-
justify.
ugly in the sense of the conversations that were happening in the spaces.
No, just even, I mean, quite literally in terms of, for example, the decoration, the decors, the complete transformation of the installation that was as it was in the first day, and also, but yes, also like a certain uncomfortable space about certain groups sort of taking over
Mm.
the building in ways that weren't normally performed in exhibitions. But it was, yeah, it was really interesting to watch this development. And for me, it was an experiment. I've learned a lot about what I also think that I shouldn't do in the future and setting up certain limits. But for me, it was really important at the time to think about this giving up control over the project, this idea of handing over the project to others. Was interesting, but
You
yeah,
know,
and I do believe that it's important to open up that space and create discomfort
mm,
within the institution. I think it's quite productive.
I was just going to pick up on that theme as well because it makes me think of the idea of decolonizing museum,
Mm,
which has been a real cry that's come forward. I think it's particularly common that idea in
mm,
London, but it's certainly proliferated here in the United States and I'm sure
yeah,
elsewhere in Europe,
of
and
course.
further beyond. And it strikes me that that idea of decolonization almost necessitates at least a stage of discomfort. And so if you're avoidant of the discomfort, then you can never hope to address the problematic aspects of the legacies of the institutions that we're living within. So do you think of that as part of your overall project as a professional, as a curator, that kind of productive discomfort?
Mm. Um, I would like to think so, but it's not always possible.
Hmm.
And I think that um, I think that's desirable because I think that public institutions uh, have incredible access to the pub to a general, what we could call a general public, right? And I think in forums that tend to be more critical, often we are speaking within our bubble and we're preaching to the converted. Um, but I believe that I have then worked in bigger institutions, and I found that they are incredibly risk averse, and that has to do with a culture of conservation, of a culture of historical accuracy, even, um, that just makes any experiment out that goes a little bit out of the ordinary, and it may be in terms of displaying live element, live living things, or but the bringing about of certain subjects then becomes very diluted by the, I suppose, the series of forums and boards discussions and approvals, that it's incredibly difficult, I think, for certain ideas to make it across all of these filters.
Mm.
Um,
Well, let's
but so I haven't always been able to do this, but yeah, I do think it's really important.
maybe
Mm.
that's something we can return to in the Q&A stage, but let's not miss the last couple of projects that you brought to talk about. So
Yeah.
this one you described earlier to me as a kind of expedition, and I'm curious
Mm.
form it took exactly.
Yeah, so we were invited by, this is a Decorators project. We were invited by um, uh, Walk and Talk, who are a festival in the Azores in São Miguel Island, to do a public art circuit, which they do every edition. They happen, their festival, they happen every year, and they have a public art program as part of their core activities, and they invited us to go. And so we said yes. We were very excited to work in the Azores, and we visited. And the Azores are a really interesting archipelago of islands because they sit at the intersection of three tectonic plates in the Atlantic Ocean. So they're a volcanic archipelago. They weren't populated by humans until the 14th century, when the Portuguese colonized these islands, and so they're very interesting as well because they sit geographically, not only because the fact that they are at this intersection that generates a lot of volcanic activity, but also because they are sort of halfway through or halfway between Europe and South America, or at least they're a way station between the two. And so the Azores have been a laboratory for nature, for a lot of species, for example, that would be brought from the then New World into Europe for botanical gardens, etc. And so they were a site of interest to many expeditions. And these expeditions that happened mostly in the 19th century, they were produced by mostly Northern European people that went to the island, and they've then did these books like this one you were seeing in the images, books that are documents of the expedition. And they catalog species and landscapes, even the people, the architecture of the islands, and classify. And so it's a way of it's a knowledge practice very much in line with the values of the Enlightenment, very much in line with the time in which they were produced. But when we were in the Azores, we found that this was a landscape that really didn't want to be inhabited. It's a landscape that doesn't want to be domesticated. Almost, the last eruption happened, the big one, 50 years ago. It was fully documented. It's really incredible to watch. There have been relatively contemporary, very dramatic, natural transformations of this territory. And we wanted to. So we thought we would. So we thought, we are foreigners and we're going to the Azores, like Darwin went to the Azores and many others. And we are going with a group of artists. So aren't we doing an expedition of some kind? And so it was maybe it started with a sort of self-critical reflection, and then we thought, okay, so what if we turned this expedition into one that is concerned or interested in the things, the events, that you cannot explain, that cannot be measured, that cannot be contained within rational systems of measurement, of analysis. What if could we do an expedition that deals with these unintelligible phenomena that are happening in this place? And so that was so we called it Expedition Empathy, because we thought that we're going to fill with this landscape in a sense, and we came together. We brought a series of designers and architects and artists that together with us, we went together on this adventure. So here we're looking at a hole on the ground. This is a traditional form of cooking in the Azores. And for example, we created a very long table. We decorated, designed a very, very, very long table with a hole at the end of it that would coincide with the hole on the ground, so that food could be removed from the hole into the table directly, because normally the process is that a few people from the council come and they extract the food and then they can take it to a restaurant. So you never see this magical process or this, so we wanted to sort of heighten that dimension. Okay, so here it is. Yeah. And then we worked with a food designer, Inês Neto dos Santos. She worked through the whole project based on fermentation, collaboration with these microorganisms and bacteria of the island. And then she collaborated also with a local cook, and they developed together this bread recipe that was cooked in the ground. And there were, there were a series of other projects, like really beautiful interventions with the landscape that allowed you to question historical accuracy, the idea of, anyway, it's probably too much to talk about now, but
the resonances with the earlier project that we looked at, Ridley's, it's like you took some of the DNA of that project and then transported it into this totally different place and reimagined aspects of it.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but it's it's very true.
Well, let's wrap up with the subject of fiction, which is something you mentioned right at the beginning of the conversation. Yeah. That was, in fact, an important way into the field of design for you.
Mm-hmm.
And here we're looking at a project that really focuses specifically on that, and I suppose you might say a kind of literary turn in your practice might be one way of talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So can you finish off our conversation by talking about this more recent project?
Yes, indeed, fiction was always present. I remember when Exist did that project I mentioned, Dalston Mill. I interviewed them, and I remember Nicholas Henninger was there. They were at the time they were sleeping and living in that place, and as they would normally do. And I remember asking him, so this is a fiction, right? Like I think your project is just it's an architectural fiction, and he absolutely disagreed with me. And at the time I felt really sad because he said, no, Mariana, this is really not anything like a fiction. This is real. Look, we've built it. It's here. It's and I was really puzzled. Fair point, exactly. And I was so puzzled by that. But at that point, I also realized that in the field of architecture, that we don't really have a lot of, and design perhaps too, even though of course Dunn and Raby have done an amazing work at filling that gap, and many others, but we don't have so many terms to deal with this nuance of this space between the real and the fictional. And so that's what encouraged me actually to do my PhD on this, and trying to do this, and trying to investigate literary fiction. I was looking specifically at the field of possible worlds, to try and see, could we expand our vocabulary in the field of design, like broadly speaking. I'm putting architecture in there, but so that we can speak about intentionality a bit more, and temporality, and what makes a project, when does a project become recognizably real, or what's that space between? So that's more like a parallel research I was doing, perhaps more scholarly, but I'm fascinated by the power that design has to put something, an idea out there through the formulation of a prototype, and not just a material prototype, but also a social prototype, because from the moment that it is used and occupied and lived, by a number of people, then perhaps what seemed like an utopian proposition can become a tiny bit more plausible. Or and so that's I think what is normally my motivation. But here in this project, sorry, that little detour, but in this project I wanted to, this was for the Porto Design Biennial, and I thought, and we discussed doing a program around design and fiction and curatorial practice with the organization. I thought I should invite 4 groups of practitioners that were developed, like important figures in this field, and that would be kind enough to come to Porto and do a workshop open to young practitioners here in Porto, to as a means to extend their methodologies to them and share them. And so the idea here was that there was a 3-day workshop in 4 different rooms in parallel in one same house. The one we were looking at was led by Marina Otero with Malik Mohamud and E.B. Camp, and it was really about they were looking at colonial monuments in Porto, or monuments that embody colonial narratives, and through AR in an augmented reality realm, they were distorting them and dissolving them, disforming those, which was really interesting. And then there were 3 other rooms with different methodologies, one by Danan Raby, one by Jan Bolen and Vera Sacchetti, and one by Danny Admis and Gillian Russell.
I was just going to say that that idea of altering problematic monuments through augmented reality is so relevant right now because of all the statues.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it's funny. I was speaking with Ibi about that actually. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this reminds me of something that Leo Warner from 59 Productions said a week ago on our series, which he defined design, at least for his practice, as the pathway from an idea to a result. And so he thought of design as being very much like a field of action rather than as a classification of object. And that seems to resonate with something that you're saying here about design as a kind of speculative operation, or something that is akin to the process of creating a narrative structure or a storyline, as a literary author might do.
Yes, I think it's a more like dirty way of practicing literature, away from the cleanness of the rendering studios or for the cinema. There's this sort of fiction that is produced in these very shiny computer screens. There's a sort of fiction that is produced in the calmness of a writer's studio. And I think that there's also a kind of fiction that is produced in the messiness of the everyday. I suppose that's a space I'm interested in, not just in terms of my practice, but other practices as well. In what's the moment? There's the moment of creating a project, but then there's also a moment when that project is introduced to the world, co-opted, transformed, and I'm interested in these degrees of reality, I suppose.
Yeah, this phrase that you used for the publication, also prototyping the otherworldly, is a really nice way into that, because it just makes you think about the fact that design, whether it's avant-garde or simply kind of cutting-edge stylistic design, often presents itself to the world as futuristic, and then it becomes the everyday material culture of the world sometimes. And so it does have this kind of alienating, or maybe I should just say alien quality, when it first presents itself to you. So it's like focusing on that moment of tremor or disruption, perhaps. One of the things in that project.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I just, before we get questions from the audience, and please, if you do have a question for Mariana, please put it in the chat box. I wanted to ask you about the Istanbul Design Biennial, which is something that you had on your to-do list this year.
Yes.
Massively disrupted, along with so much else that's been going on. Can you share a little bit about how you've been thinking about that project?
Yeah, of course. So I'm the project, the theme that we chose for the Istanbul Biennial is empathy, or an idea of revisiting empathy. And as you've seen, I've explored already this like unpack. I started to unpack this idea of empathy in the project we did in the Azores with Decorators. But I was very interested that empathy itself as a term, it's an idea that develops around the transition to the 20th century. It's a very recent term, and it's in the beginning, when it first was translated from the German Einfühlung, which means feeling into,
Hmm.
it was used to describe how we might, or how certain objects, such as a chair or a painting or a sculpture, might elicit bodily responses
Hmm.
in us. And so it started as an aesthetic theory, but it was very much about this idea of sharing of feelings between human and non-human things. And they could be design pieces, as I mentioned, and art pieces, but also the natural world. And it's later that the term empathy then became about a human, understanding another person's feelings. This idea is much more recent, and so for me it was interesting to recover this original meaning of the term in the current time of where ideas around posthumanism are relatively current, and so that was a little bit that was the departure point, to think that design, or to ask how can design act as a mediator between human and non-human actors, but an emotional mediator. So it was a way of reclaiming ideas of feeling, affect, and attachment to things and landscapes and the world around us. Because I think that's very urgent. And I had been, the Eco Visionaries project that I did for the last 4 or 5 years. Was a project that really investigated how design, architecture, and art are responding to the climate crisis we're facing, and I find it that it's really urgent to find ways other than the rational numbers we read on the newspaper to engage with subjects like this, and I think that design can play a really important role in there. So that was the beginning of our thinking. Of course, COVID was a difficult obstacle, and it's forced us, but it was also interesting. With designers, we love problems to solve, I think, and it forced us also to reimagine a little bit what the biennial model was. And to think what can a biennial do in this moment in time. And so I'm now working with Samitra Upham and Billy Muraban. They're both part of my team. So we've been thinking together how to, and with the Istanbul team as well, of course, how to respond to not to respond to COVID, because of course I think people will not want to hear the stories about COVID after we're back to a relative normal, but to think, what's the role of a biennial now?
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the biennial will actually involve a lot of people together in one place, or is that not even on the cards longer?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I think that's a model that we should perhaps question or challenge a little bit, right? For environmental reasons, everyone flying to one place is not very sustainable. And also the transport of pieces. I mean, the idea that that a biennial gathers together work that has been produced all over the world and brings it to one place, is that the model we should continue to pursue? I'm not sure. Of course, there's an immense value in bringing the state of the art into one place, so that a lot of people can enjoy it together. But maybe we need to think in a different way. I think that is many of these global ideas around production, but also culture, I think they've failed us now, and so I think we really need to think about other models. Anyway, that's what we.
Well, and that idea.
That's how we are thinking, that we have a local. I know we are thinking in these terms, that we have a local audience, and that we cherish very much, and for whom we want to be able to create some form of legacy. And we also have a digital spectatorship, and so the work we've been doing has been in reconciling these two very different forms of engagement with design works.
Yeah, you know, I was just going to say that the idea of empathy as something that involves things and the material world as opposed to people, that seems like well, it's a very current concept. I think also of Jane Bennett's book Vibrant Matter, which a lot of designers have been reading, of course.
Yes,
that kind of that direction of thinking, but it makes me think that that kind of material empathy might actually be quite a productive response to the crisis of the coronavirus, but also more specifically to this question of how design curation should transition out of something like the conventional biennial, dragging things from around the world and people from around the world, and instead think about creating these experiential situations for local audiences. That feels like it all kind of hangs together in some way, although I can't quite make it into a kind of formula, but it seems like it's a very set of
and it's interesting because this local dimension in your work in this respect is really important, you know, in this particular moment, perhaps even more so. But this, I think, the recognition that the local scale and knowledge are incredibly valuable, and I think after COVID, we are perhaps better positioned to, because we've gained a new perspective, and so we can now perhaps recognize that the value of what we have immediately next to us, and how important it is to develop a culture of attachment with those contexts.
Yeah. And the collaborative mode of curating that you've been working in for so long, of course, is also very consistent with that, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, in Istanbul, we've created a young curators group. So I'm really happy to be working with 3 curators based in Istanbul. We will reveal them as well now very soon. But and that's fundamental. To engage, you know, their knowledge, of course, of the context and their own networks and their perspective on the subjects we're covering has been really, you know, very enriching to the program, and that's what's allowing us also to do that, right? To be closer to Istanbul.
I always feel like when you collaborate, your collaborators are the first audience, so it's like a way of from your own sense of private authorship into that more public conversation.
That's true.
We have a couple of questions before we close. First, I wanted to ask John Pround from the Chipstone Foundation in Milwaukee to come on. And John, I know you've been working a lot in the arena of fictional curating and the use of narratives in exhibition space. So do you want to say hi, and if you have any questions for Mariana as well?
Yes.
Hey, John.
Hey there, how are you doing?
Hi.
Certainly, thank you. Yeah, we really love seeing your work, and especially this idea of dancing around reality and fiction. What it's done with us, we've created a space called Mrs. M's Room, which is kind of an active quasi-historical curatorial space. And what you start to realize is that actually in some of these fictive spaces, you end up doing better history than gets done in the conventional galleries and using conventional hierarchies and historical pathways. I was curious, with your projects, how do you deal, and this becomes really relevant as we do more and more of these sort of activated projects, but with your design projects that involve an audience and participation, how do you deal with issues of access and equity? You know, who's able to get involved, and how do you work with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This is something that we've developed over time. So in the beginning, we thought that leaving some empty seats would probably that we would always leave empty seats as part of our programs for a latecomer or someone or a passerby who would be interested, for them to join in. But we realized that wasn't enough because, of course, just the nature of our projects would attract a certain audience, that our own connections, our own networks, etc. So then we began developing methodologies to reach out more. So for example, the radio project that I showed you then evolved into a radio methodology that was carried on mostly by Carolina and Suzanne. And they came up with a system where they would also not just interview people, but also organize interviewing workshops, so that then in schools, in cultural centers, community venues, so that the interviewing could be then carried on by others than other people that wouldn't be us. I don't know if this really answers your question, but that's, for example, a way that we found could be useful. But it's really difficult, especially when you're working in a place that is not your own neighborhood. So often we try to find partners that then guide us through the project. I think finding the collaborators is then perhaps the general way that we found to be able to see a place through somebody else's eyes, I guess.
Yeah. So it requires a level of experience and in-depth engagement and involvement. It's not just a matter of leaving empty space nor just stage managing something on first encounter. It's also relying on that existing expertise.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's it. But having said that, this is a discussion we have over and over again. We haven't resolved it, and we, between ourselves, we are conscious that our work is not that of an NGO, or we don't have any. We're design practitioners, and so we also don't try not to have the arrogance of thinking that our projects will effectively produce the kind of change that other institutions can.
Yeah.
No.
Let's take just one last question, which is also on the theme of community, and it's from Noel Newell. Noel, please ask the question directly if you'd like. Otherwise, I can read it out.
Oh, okay. Hi. I just, I love going to like a biennale. I went to the Venice Biennale 5 years ago. I go to Maison Objet and Paris Deco off every year. And there's always something that happens when you go. And when you were talking about the Biennale in Istanbul with the theme of empathy, I thought, oh, how fantastic. When things get better, I want to go to that Biennale. Because when you leave your comfort of your home and you traverse the globe and you discover so many things, and you have chance meetings and chance experiences, even just trying to figure out how to get from point A to B can be an adventure, and you have some discovery. And then you might even run into friends, from New York. And so I would be sad to see that go. I do think that things were kind of like in Paris, because that's where I tend to go the most. Things were just getting so large and crazy. And with the strike, I couldn't go to Maison Objet, but I only concentrated on Paris Deco off. But how would we replace that when we want to be more environmentally, conscientious? We want to be more, maybe more literally, more curated, more specific. But how would we replace these things? Like, I being in my home, for so long, not having connectivity, like I work from my home, to be able to go to yoga class and then not being able to do that. How do we bring people together? Because we all have that in common. We're social animals. What would be the alternatives? I mean, how do we do this in a virtual way? Or how do we bridge, like have it continue of biennales and art fairs, but maybe have some things available online, which must also be more democratic because it would be more inclusive and bring prices down. But we sort of need to get together, and we need to have people who kind of take a crazy risk and come from some place that's maybe a little bit out of their budget and go, because it could be life-changing in a positive way.
Mariana, what about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it's very difficult. You know, I obviously don't have an answer. The virtual, I know, doesn't even come close to what it is to be together, and I think that we will have to relearn how to be together after this very strange and painful moment we're living. So I think that we will be tackling a little bit of that, because obviously our biennial is about being together with one another, but also recognizing that we're also how we can be together with microorganisms and and other friends, and recognizing and developing an attachment for these perhaps more complex mix of friends, we could say. But I don't know, I find it really difficult in this moment. We were talking about fiction earlier, and often fiction develops always from a model of reality that then gets a little bit distorted or exaggerated or mirrored, and that's often how even design projects that deal with fiction operate, right? That they replicate. For example, we did a restaurant, replicated that model, but then changed just the exchange system. A lot of design practitioners exaggerate present time conditions, etc. But the reality that we're living in is so extreme at the moment with everything that's happening that I think I find it paralyzing. It's very complicated, I believe, to see what will come next. And even the biggest thinkers of our time, texts that were written in February and March by the great minds of our century, were very quickly dated. And so I think we'll have to be very patient now and wait until we understand reality a little bit better, and then perhaps we can start making predictions. But Noel, I understand and I feel you. I do obviously believe that it's great to go to different places and exchange ideas and knowledge. We might find a way to do it more sustainably, hopefully, after this strange climatic experience that we're living.
Well, certainly that idea of relearning to be together, that's a very powerful idea. And I feel like one thing is certain, which is that your curatorial practice has prepared you well for helping think through that question. So watch this space, I guess. Well, being together on Zoom is not the same as being together at a pop-up experimental curatorial restaurant. It's been a real pleasure, Mariana.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you for your questions.
I do want to let folks know that we have, of course, another Design and Dialogue coming up on Monday. We're going to be speaking to Rennie Ramakers, who also is principally a curator with a similarly global practice, although she's best known for having co-founded the very influential design group Droog in the Netherlands in the early 90s. She has a lot more to say about some of her recent projects as well in South America and Africa and elsewhere. So please come back on Monday to hear from Rennie Ramakers. And Mariana, thanks again for being with us on Design and Dialogue.
Thank you, Glenn. Nice to see you.